In this case, this is a dispute brought by South Africa, claiming that Israel is undertaking genocidal actions and with genocidal intent. And the legal basis for this complaint, this application to the International Court of Justice, is that both South Africa and Israel are parties to the 1948 Genocide Convention. And so this is a complaint that South Africa is making, that it is entitled to make as a signatory to the Genocide Convention, which compels all of the signatory countries, including Israel, to abide by the terms of the Genocide Convention. It's stunning, amazing to watch these proceedings. South Africa filed an extremely detailed application, 84 pages, describing both the intentionality of Israel in destroying Gaza, in making Gaza uninhabitable, and the actions of Israel in bombing core infrastructure, in blocking the inflows of water, food, medicine, fuel that are basic necessities of life. And the combination of the statements by Israeli leaders, from the prime minister and president through the cabinet to members of the Knesset to leaders of the Israel Defense Forces, is a shocking list of statements, because these are statements saying flat out that Gaza is to be destroyed, is to be made uninhabitable, that there is no distinction between Hamas and the civilians, that everybody is guilty. And no doubt these Israeli leaders would like to walk back what they said, because what they said was flat out unbelievably ugly and destructive. And I think South Africa makes a compelling case expressive of genocidal intent. So to watch this in a body of law rather than in the spin of, say, a White House briefing or somebody just brushing this aside, as John Kirby did when he said, well, this is a bunch of nonsense. The United States rejects all of this as nonsense, or the president of Israel is saying this is a blood libel. But to hear it spelled out methodically, hour after hour in precise judicial proceedings, is, I think, a historic day, because Israel is being examined closely for what it has said and what it is doing. And this is, to my mind, the highest responsibility and application of the concept of international law. So I think it's a very big day.
The law is very clear, and so our listeners know why you dwelt extensively on intent, and why the document itself quotes at length statements from Prime Minister Netanyahu and from many, many people in the Israeli government who pull the levers of power, and the things they said were utterly repellent. You seem to have paused for a second trying to find an adjective horrific enough to describe what they said, but things like burn them alive, bury them alive, they're subhuman. How do you characterize that? What kind of a mind can justify that kind of slaughter of innocents? But to my point, the law requires that the applicant here, South Africa, show not only that genocide took place, but that it wasn't an accident, that it was intentional. And when you can use, I can tell you this from my prior life on the bench, when you can use the words of your adversary to prove your case, that is the most compelling way to prove your case. Let's watch just a minute or so of the initial opening argument this morning. You may have seen this already, Professor Sachs. This is cut 13, Jeff, the opening statement.
The violence and the destruction in Palestine and Israel did not begin on the 7th of October 2023. The Palestinians have experienced systematic oppression and violence for the last 76 years. On 6 October 2023, and every day since October the 7th, 2023. In the Gaza Strip, at least since 2004, Israel continues to exercise control over the airspace, territorial waters, land crossing, water, electricity, and civilian infrastructure, as well as over key government functions. No armed attack on a state territory, no matter how serious, even an attack involving atrocity crimes, can provide any justification for or defense to breaches to the convention, whether as a matter of law or morality. Israel's response to the 7th of October 2023 attack has crossed this line and
last clip, just for those unfamiliar with this kind of a court proceeding, the very end of the clip, you saw all 15 judges, 2 judges added to the panel, one from Israel, one from South Africa. The other 13 are permanent. It's interesting. I thought of you, Professor Sachs, when I saw the name of the person was added, and I saw the last name Barak, and I thought, oh my God, this is the former prime minister and former general, but it's not. It's the former chief justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, a opponent of Prime Minister Netanyahu, whom the Israeli government designated. He's 87 years old, but he's the grand old man, if you will, of Israel law and judiciary, universally respected, and they designated him. I want you to see one more argument before you weigh in, and this is the argument of another lawyer for South Africa who shows a video, and I want you to be able to assess the significance of the video that he shows. Chris?
On 7 December 2023, Israeli soldiers proved that they understood the Prime Minister's message to remember what the Amalek has done to you as genocidal. They were recorded by journalists dancing and singing. We know our motto, there are no uninvolved, that they obey one commandment, to wipe off the seed of Amalek. The Prime Minister's invocation of Amalek is being used by soldiers to justify the killing of civilians, including children. These are the soldiers repeating the inciting words of their Prime Minister.
All right, let's start at the end. What is the significance of Israeli soldiers in Gaza dancing and chanting, "We come to address Amalek"?
Well, there is a very important subtext to all of this, which is the use of biblical symbology and biblical and religious beliefs that are part of Israel's rhetoric and core to Israel's politics. Amalek is a part of the Bible when the Israelites are instructed by God to kill all of this nation. And it is one of many genocides, in fact, in the Old Testament. The book of Joshua, which is the part of the Bible, the 6th book of the Old Testament, in which the Israelites, after having escaped from Egypt, in the Exodus from Egypt, arrive at their promised land and are instructed by God, according to the book of Joshua, to not only take the land, but to kill every man, woman, and child in the land that they are to take. And it's very clear repeatedly from one nation to the next in the book of Joshua that this is to be a genocide, that no one shall survive. Now, fast forward 2,600 years, and these texts are being referred to explicitly by the prime minister, by the Israel Defense Forces, and by a large part of the Israeli politics, much of which reflects a religious zealotry that takes the Bible as the literal basis for action. And the Bible has in these texts the instructions for genocide, for killing everybody. And we hear this echo not only in the video that the South African lawyer showed, but in a shocking compilation of videos that Gray Zone produced. Max Blumenthal, the investigative reporter, produced, released, and posted on Gray Zone a compilation that is filled one after another with this biblical reference, this genocidal fever, and the chanting and delight at the destruction of everybody. So what we're seeing here is a mix of military brutality, religious zealotry, political manipulation in a concoction that is extraordinary. I think it is so foreign to our eyes to see this, but in the court, to have it laid out so explicitly, and the court is a place of decorum. You saw the lawyer, how dignified and eloquent he was. I listened to much of his presentation earlier in the day, and the room was silent, listening, having to absorb this direct evidence, not having the ever-present and, for me, utterly disgusting spin from the White House newsroom or some other spin, but actually listening to the realities, grim realities, laid out one by one. That's why I think this was a historic day.
Here's what the White House actually had to say about it. This is, I think you've seen this, and I know you won't be happy, and neither am I, but we have to expose this stuff. Here's Admiral Kirby expressing the White House's opinion on this is 3 or 4 days ago, so this is before the oral argument, on the application, the 84-page complaint filed by South Africa.
South Africa's filed this 84-page lawsuit against Israel, accusing them of genocide. Israel says that this is blood libel. Does Washington agree? And where does this put Washington and Pretoria?
We find this submission meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any basis in fact whatsoever.
I guess he didn't read it if he finds it meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any basis in fact. And I guess Washington is the only country in the world willing to make a statement as outrageous as that.
You know, I find him insufferable day by day.
I do know that.
Yes, you know, I don't exactly hide it, because I just wish there were grown-ups in power, grown-ups who were responsible, who were honest, who were decent, who would read an 84-page detailed complaint and give a serious answer rather than a one-sentence smack off like that. I wish at the same time that the White House press corps would follow up more seriously. Actually, if I remember correctly, that question started with a few words, just a quick one. Right. And then the question was asked, and Kirby responded in this utterly disgusting way when the most important issue on the planet is in front of him, and couldn't do more than one dismissive, phony, and false statement but then there's no follow-up. Then they move on to the next topic and the next topic.
I sometimes
And this,
think those questions are staged, Jeff, and it's terrible. It's terrible for the American public, and it's demeaning to the profession of journalism.
yes, how could the journalist say, Mr. Kirby, it's 84 detailed pages, and you say there's no factual basis? Why don't we look at page 10? Why don't we look at page 12? Why don't the journalists do their job? Rather than feeding us the propaganda from the White House, they should be questioning the propaganda. That's why I was grateful for today's court proceedings, because there were hours to put forward the evidence. There is a detailed legal complaint. There are dozens of countries that have supported this, but the US government is all spin, all propaganda, and all attempt at narrative control. And Judge Napolitano, that's why you're doing such a service, because you're bringing these issues to the public attention and to the world attention. But the press that's in that room doesn't even follow up with another question.
Right. Your criticism of the press is right on. I want to mention something. You mentioned Max Blumenthal, who's my friend and who regularly appears on the show. Yesterday on the show, he challenged Bobby Kennedy to a debate on Israel, and I offered to moderate the debate. Now that's out there. Chris tells me it was tossed about in Twitter or X, whatever they call themselves now, last night. So I hope that comes to pass. I would imagine the audience would be huge. It would be difficult for me to be perfectly neutral because I can see with my own eyes what's happening. But if I am privileged to moderate that debate, I will be neutral. What defense should we expect tomorrow? Today is all opening arguments from the lawyers from South Africa. Tomorrow, the Israeli lawyers, who, by the way, are British barristers, take over. What conceivable defense could there be? What mentality of humanity justifies the slaughter of 26,000 people, at most 3,000 of whom were soldiers?
Well, they're going to say that this is in self-defense, that a terrible terrorist attack occurred on October 7, which is true. But as the South African prosecutor said today, that is no defense under the Genocide Convention. They're going to say that these statements are aimed at Hamas, their military enemy, not at the civilian population. That is plainly false, because the statements are explicit about all of the population. They're going to say that they take exquisite care in protecting the civilians, which is utterly false, because they have put a siege on Gaza, stopped the food, the water, the fuel, the medical supplies. They are going to say that they are careful in their targeting of Hamas, which is plainly false, because 70% of those killed are women and children, and many of the men killed are absolutely not Hamas soldiers. So Israel is going to have a defense of self-defense, but they're going to deny what is plainly in front of the world's eyes, which are genocidal statements that are pervasive and rampant, and actions against the entire civilian population, not at all targeted, at a massive loss of life that is overwhelmingly civilian, and the displacement of 2 million people, where Hamas has perhaps 30,000 fighters. So Israel is going to make a defense of self-defense that is itself not defensible, because the plain facts are contrary to what Israel has been saying every day since this invasion into Gaza began.
Do you have a finger on the pulse of how American Jews view the genocide? I mean, I understand Joe Biden is caught in a vice. He's caught between the donor class, the AIPAC folks, and younger people that are traditionally Democrats, but who are horrified by the genocide. So question one is, should the United States be a co-defendant? And then if we come back to the U.S., you know, you live and work at Columbia University, large Jewish American population in Manhattan. You have a finger on the pulse about how they feel. Answer either question in which either order you wish, any order you wish.
I think it's quite clear from the opinion surveys that the broad American public is aghast at what's happening because they're watching, like all of us, day by day, a slaughter of civilians. I think it's clear that there is a generational gradient, as you pointed out, where young people are absolutely defending the Gazan civilian population, whereas older people are tending more towards backing Israel because that is the way that it has been for decades. But even so, even among older respondents to the opinion surveys, there is a tremendous, tremendous unease. And in the Jewish community, of course, it's very divided. It's divided by age, it's divided by class, it's divided by interest group, it's divided by different parts of American Jewry, from Reform to Orthodox. But even within Orthodox Jewry, the most religious, there are parts of Orthodox Jewry, notably the Satmar community in Brooklyn, New York, which says that the whole concept of Israel and Zionism was misconceived because in their view it was religiously misconceived. And of course, other Orthodox Jews take a different view. So it's a lot of division. What we don't have is any overwhelming groundswell of support for Israel in this. Quite the contrary. The American people, every time they're asked and have an opportunity to speak, say ceasefire now.
Right.
Americans do not want to be complicit in this massacre and in this genocide, as South Africa is describing it today in the International Court of Justice.
Should the U.S. be a co-defendant, Professor Sachs?
Well, the U.S. is going to be a co-defendant in the court of public opinion because the overwhelming understanding of the world is that Israel could not do this from one day to the next without the United States' active support. And it is active support in one absolutely key way, which is providing the bombs, the munitions, the artillery, the shells that are killing people and that are destroying the habitability and the infrastructure and that have displaced nearly the entire population. And so the Americans wring their hands. Blinken says we have to take more care of civilians and so forth, but then signs an order that subverts congressional oversight to directly deliver the munitions to Israel, no strings attached, no conditions whatsoever, so that this continues. So America is complicit. And a subtext of this is that America is on trial as well, because America is Israel's sole backer in the military campaign that is underway in Gaza.
I want to run two clips for you, both involving someone you and I know and whose work we admire, Medea Benjamin, who is an American Jew. Also someone you and I know, Congressman Jamie Raskin. In the first clip, Congressman Raskin is giving a speech condemning authoritarian governments outside the Capitol. Watch what happens to Medea while she is silently standing there. And then we'll go right into the second clip, which is a few days later. Medea is in the hallways of the Senate, and she approaches two senators, Rick Scott of Florida and John Cornyn of Texas. It's very interesting to hear what Scott and Cornyn say to her, because it's based on the Israeli propaganda. So first with Jamie Raskin and then with the two senators.
The political scientists tell us that the hallmarks of an authoritarian or fascist political party are that, one, they do not accept the results of democratic elections that don't go their way. Two, they refuse to renounce or they openly embrace political violence as an instrument.
What's the matter with something wrong with the sign? It's well not about the law.
They
hold Israel accountable.
They accept.
They're worse than Jan 6. Hold Israel accountable.
Israel is not about the law.
They accept. I'm sorry. Let me just start that again.
They beheaded babies.
No, they did not. They did not. That's just propaganda to keep this war going. It's a genocide. We need a ceasefire. Will you please call for a ceasefire?
You're going to get Hamas to quit shooting innocent civilians?
Well, it's the Israeli bombs that are killing thousands and thousands of people, including children and women, every single day.
Spoken like Senator Scott and Senator Cornyn had just come from an AIPAC meeting.
Well, you can't make this up that you're having a speech by Congressman Jamie Raskin against authoritarianism and somebody peacefully holding up a sign is pulled away by the police. It looks like a comedy if it weren't a tragedy.
Looks like it's a scene from Seinfeld.
It looks like a Saturday Night Live skit, frankly, that it just is so sad. Now, the senators, this is typical right now. They're arrogant and they're ignorant, and they keep the military-industrial complex well-fed, and the military-industrial complex keeps them well-fed and in power. So it's a game. They're playing a game. They don't want the American people involved. They don't want to have to answer questions. It's like Kirby. Nobody wants any questions asked. It's all narrative to keep their game going. It's a racket. It's $1 trillion a year racket. They've got a lot of military arms sales. They like it. The military industrial industry keeps these people in power. And anyone that is pesky enough to ask a question just is bad behavior, because who asked you to ask us? We are the military industrial complex. Thank you. It's none of your business. That's the basic message.
Professor Sachs from Phnom Penh, Cambodia, thank you very much for joining us, my dear friend. I don't know where you'll be next week, but we will want the benefit of your analysis.
We'll connect. Very good. All right. Take care.
Thank you,
Thanks.
my dear friend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Coming up, as indicated at 11 o'clock this morning, live from Moscow, Scott Ritter. At 2 this afternoon, Kyle Anzalone, new young guest whose analysis we enjoy very much, coming to us from antiwar.com. The great Professor John Mearsheimer at 3 o'clock, and the boys, Larry and Ray, that is Johnson and McGovern, in the Intel Roundtable at 4. A busy day, a day for you. And by the way, our subscriptions are.
Would you agree that China is using this Hamiltonian approach to economics, perhaps coming from Sun Yat-sen, whose influence who is highly influenced by Hamilton?
Well, China has what I would simply call a mixed economy, which means it's partly state-directed, partly market-directed. I think all successful economies are mixed economies. And the U.S., even when it uses free market rhetoric, of course, has a large role of the government, not necessarily accurate role, but a large role of government in in the economy. Different countries come down differently on how they carve up the relative weights and responsibilities of public, private, and civil society sectors. It's true that the UK-US approach is relatively more on the laissez-faire side. I'd say relatively more. We're lower taxes, certainly as a share of national income, a much lower social outlays. The UK more than the United States, even though it started with laissez-faire in the 19th century. The UK adopted a national health service, of course, after World War II. The United States never did that. China's a very pragmatic and economically well-governed country. Very impressive during the past 40 years because they've had a planning model with a major role of state finance combined with a very dynamic and competitive market sector and a very entrepreneurial lead in many sectors as well. I was just in China and noted a huge rise of electric vehicles. And there are hundreds of electric vehicle companies right now, startups. It's expected that the number will whittle down quickly to perhaps between 5 and 10 such companies. But right now it's named to be in the hundreds of companies producing electric vehicles. And it's a fiercely competitive market inside China. Now, when it comes to the international side, China's just doing a lot of things that the United States did for a while after World War II, which was help finance infrastructure abroad, make the way for U.S. multinational companies, in fact. And China right now is doing that. The United States doesn't do much internationally at all other than war, but it doesn't do peaceful economic development activities, and you can see in the rhetoric of American leaders, politicians, their resentment that China dares to help other countries to build infrastructure. You know, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a very valid and quite beneficial win-win program of China, together with more than 150 other countries, by the way, is badmouthed every day by the United States, mainly out of resentment and jealousy, because the U.S. doesn't have that kind of spirit to make connections with other countries, and China is making massive investments and working with other countries to help them with developing an electric power grid, basic renewable energy sources, fast rail, 5G technologies, paved roads and highways, and many other desirable things that those counterpart countries really need. Now Biden is talking about a road project from India to the Mideast. And he's so proud of this one road. It doesn't exist. It's not financed. It's it may be a good idea, but it's a little pathetic, actually, to tell you the truth, because China has dozens of projects like this all over the world. The United States has thought about one. Literally, I guess they took the one belt, one road idea, but they took one road. There's one corridor that they're talking about, whereas China is doing dozens of these projects. So the U.S. is kind of looking on.
I think that IMEC program is dead with the war now.
Yes, I think that's right. And we're so paralyzed, so ineffective, so paralyzed with everything, so war-driven, that an idea of a road becomes about the best that we can do, and a road that perhaps never will be built.
Right. Okay, well, look, I'll come back to China, but I also knew that you were at the Valdai discussion club, and I was told actually by Richard Sakwa, whom I interviewed yesterday, whom you know, he was also speaking at Valdai, but he told me that you were speaking there on the question of the discussion for a new currency and a new international trade mechanism that's taking place within the BRICS. I think you know that Sergei Glaziev, who has been a key economist in formulating these ideas, working with China and the other BRICS countries, and now really the whole global South, working on putting together this kind of idea. And you probably know that Lyndon LaRouche, that Glaziev has openly praised Lyndon LaRouche's economic ideas, and especially the article he wrote in the year 2000, which was called Toward a Basket of Hard Commodities, Trade Without Currency. So perhaps you can say a bit about where you think that whole plan stands today. I was not able to find the video of your presentation at Valdai, so I'm counting on you to fill us in.
Basically, I noted that having one dominant currency in the world, which has been the U.S. dollar after World War II, and which was the pound sterling before World War I, has certain advantages because money is just a means of settling transactions for the real economy, for the non-monetary economy. So having a single currency can be efficient, but the U.S. Has blown it by weaponizing the dollar. The U.S. Had an advantage because other countries and international businesses use the dollar, and that does give benefits to the U.S., so-called seniorage benefits and other benefits, but essentially the ease of borrowing abroad and very high liquidity of your own national currency. But the U.S. started to weaponize the dollar, meaning rather than letting it be used just for transactions purposes, the United States used this special situation of having transactions pass through the dollar banking system and ultimately through the central bank of the U.S., the Federal Reserve, to start confiscating the dollars of other countries that the U.S. disagreed with in foreign policy. This is really obnoxious behavior, by the way, because the idea of money is, again, as a transactions medium, not as a hostage to foreign policy. And because the dollar was so dominant, even after the U.S. confiscated reserves of Iran or North Korea, then Venezuela, now Russia, many countries use the dollar, but they don't like to use it because they're a little afraid of saying a word that's crossed to the U.S. and then seeing the U.S. government come down on them, even freezing their money. It's pretty bad behavior, in my view, but basically very ill-advised because the BRICS countries now, and it started with the original five, with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but now it's going to include the new six, which is Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran. This is a big group of countries, and they're saying we don't want to use the dollar because, frankly, we don't want our money confiscated. And so they're going to develop an alternative payments system. They will be successful at that because it's not so hard to make payments in other ways, in renminbi or in rubles or rupees or in an R5 currency, so-called, because the original BRICS 5 all have an R currency. the real, the ruble, the rupee, the renminbi, and the rand. So they call it the R5, and they may just make a basket using those 5 currencies for denomination and even for lending and borrowing in a bond denominated in a basket of currencies. So I expect something interesting and good to come out of this. Again, it's a little bit regrettable in a way if having a single medium of exchange, it wouldn't even have to be one country. Keynes had the idea that it would be the IMF's currency, the Bancor, he called it in a famous writing, would have certain convenience. But if it's then used monopolistically for militarized or foreign policy or geopolitical purposes, it's not going to last long because there are always workarounds when it comes to trade and to financial settlements. And that's what the BRICS are doing right now. They're going to do a workaround.
I sent you just before we got on this call a article that was published by Glaziev, I think just today or at least recently, on this, in which he emphasizes that while the basket of currencies and the R5, these are definitely being implemented already in various forms, but that eventually the idea of a separate currency, maybe the R5, but some separate currency which would be also tied to a basket of commodities rather than just currencies, to, in a certain sense, tie it to the actual cost of production of the real economy. And that in general, he thinks this is something that it's basically simple to finish completing it, that he's hopeful that it can be done by next year when Russia is head of the BRICS and will be holding the BRICS conference in Kazan, I believe. So anyway, I'd be interested in your response to his article.
I haven't read it yet. Let me just say that there are several different issues involved in our discussion. One is the privilege of the U.S. to host the international currency, and I've explained why the U.S. has misused that privilege and why it's now going to lose a lot of the business, so-called, of settlements in dollars. But a second is the mechanics of payment systems, and the third is the management of monetary policy. These are all distinct issues. On the payments mechanisms, we can do something that could never have been done before, and that is digital settlements. So we don't even need a banking system now, and we don't need cash in circulation or gold bars and other or gold coins and other mechanisms that were mechanisms of settlement, because now digitally every transaction can be tracked. We know there are different ways to do it. Blockchain is one, but there are many other probably more efficient ways to do it with central bank clearing, for example. And that means that even the method of payments, I think, will likely be digital and could well be a central bank digital currency in the future. Then third question is the management of monetary policy. And this is a long debate. John Maynard Keynes wrote brilliantly about it in the 1920s and the 1930s. Should a currency, whether digital or physical, be convertible into something else, for example, gold, or into some commodity basket, or should it be what economists call a fiat currency, which is that it is only backed by the policies of the central bank or banks that issue that currency, and its value depends on expectations about those policies. And we've had more than 100 years of debate about that. The advantage of linking a currency to a commodity basket is it can't be issued for political purposes, especially to finance government payments not backed by a flow of tax revenues, for example. So you can't get a hyperinflation in a backed currency. And that's been deemed to be the advantage, that it is a kind of straitjacket and focuses on the real economy, limits the capacity to issue credit. But on the other hand, it proved to be highly disadvantageous in other circumstances. When the world was on a gold standard or a gold exchange standard, if there were long periods in which major gold deposits were not discovered, that gave, on average, a deflationary weight to the world price trends, and that was deemed to have distributional and real economy effects that were not highly desirable, although it also had some desirable effects as well. It also made it harder for central banks to be lenders of last resort in financial panics. And the Great Depression is a very complicated, fascinating, and important subject to understand about central banking and whether the gold standard was a contributor to the persistence of the Great Depression. Well, I don't want us to get into long excursus about monetary theory, except to say that there are several questions on the table right now. First, whose currency? Second, the technology of settlement. And third, the organization of monetary policy. They're all very interesting. I spent many decades studying them, and I think there's no ideal systems here, which is why we continue to have these discussions decade after decade after decade.
Right. Well, getting back to China, I did listen to your presentation in Beijing I think it was at the UN headquarters there, to, I think probably
Group of ambassadors.
Ambassadors, yeah.
Yeah.
And probably Chinese officials as well, right? But anyway, yeah, it was very interesting. I mean, you really focused on the Chinese miracle, the transformation of China over a mere 40 years into, from one of the poorest to one of the richest in history, actually, and the transformation of elimination of poverty and so forth. So, I mean, this was a quite interesting presentation. What I really found interesting was your discussion of the idea that the Chinese model would be the proper approach for dealing with the development of Africa, which, of course, is also very much part of China's role in the Belt and Road. But in particular, you contrasted that directly to the policies of the IMF, which I thought I'd ask you to elaborate on here, because it was a very interesting way of showing the failure of the IMF to bring about real development in Africa or any other part of the developing sector.
I think, to put it very straightforwardly, the rapid economic growth of China, which was by traditional measures around 10% per year growth of the domestic economy, persistently between 1980 and nearly the year 2020. So an increase that was more than 30-fold, if you accumulate, in the size of the Chinese economy, came about by investment. What does investment mean? Investment means building the capital stock of a country. What is a capital stock? A capital stock means the productive assets of an economy. What are those? Well, those are three main categories. First, what we carry in our own bodies and brains, the so-called human capital. That's the education and the skills and the health of the population. The second is the physical infrastructure. which is the roads, the power grid, the fiber optics grid, the water and sewerage systems, and fast rail, highways, all of the networking that the economy depends on. And the third is the business sector, the manufacturing industries, agriculture, and so forth. Well, if you look at China's growth during 1980 to 2020, the rates of investment were extraordinary. The rate of investment means essentially the share of the national income that is invested each year in new capital. And in the United States, the gross investment rate, which means the amount of investment that we undertake, not recognizing that some of it's just offsetting depreciation, the gross investment is something on the order of 15 to 20% of the national income. But in China, it was typically 40 to 50% of the national income. So a supercharged investment rate. Before our eyes, China built thousands of kilometers of fast rail, thousands of kilometers of a highway system, thousands of kilometers of an electricity distribution system, and on and on and on. Really impressive. And that's what powered China. That plus the huge investments in education and skills. So China started without much infrastructure at all, and it started with very poor education levels by the late 1970s because China had had so much turmoil over the preceding 150 years. But then China finally, starting in 1978, said, okay, we're going for it. Deng Xiaoping came to power. He was perhaps modern history's single most successful economic reformer. He pointed China in the right direction, said, go for growth, open the economy, make a market economy, make a mixed economy, build infrastructure, invest in the people. And lo and behold, that extraordinarily high investment rate led to 40 years of rapid growth. Now, the problem when it comes to the IMF is that the IMF does not have that vision in mind. The IMF's vision to a finance minister of a poor country is, don't bother us with your problems. Don't get into excessive debt. Don't get into a financial crisis, and don't bother us about your poverty. Thank you very much. So nobody thinks very hard about the way for these countries to get out of poverty, but the way is just like China did, which is massive investments. And then comes the question how to finance those investments. China partly borrowed in the early years, but also had a massively high saving rate internally. So as the income was rising, China wasn't consuming it in a lot of household consumer spending. Chinese households were saving a lot of their rising income. Chinese businesses were reinvesting a lot of their profits. The government wasn't running huge deficits on its current transactions and so forth. All of this meant a very high saving rate that could be turned into a high investment rate. Now, Africa right now has a very, very low saving rate because people are impoverished. They can't save more. They have to survive. So they need some help with the financing right now by essentially some international financing, say from the African Development Bank or from the Belt and Road program, in which China can provide some of the financing to build that infrastructure in Africa. But that's the advice that Africa should be getting. Invest strongly, invest heavily, borrow where you need to borrow, get your kids in school, electrify the economy, build the roads, build the fast rail, and so forth. And I think China can help to give some very good advice in that direction.
The China model. Right.
Yeah, China shows, you can have 40 years of supercharged growth, and that's what Africa needs.
40 years. Yeah, I agree. You also spoke at Chufu, the birthplace of Confucius, which now is a shrine and a museum, I believe, right? A major site.
Well, that temple, the Confucian temple, has been there for more than 2,000 years. And each emperor has come and added a stone, added an inscription, added calligraphy, because Confucius has been an intellectual hero and guidepost for China basically for 2,500 years. So it's really impressive to be there at a Confucius birthday party, which I was, because this goes back essentially 2,500 years, and it's a large complex of buildings because emperor after emperor added their own building to it. So you really get the feel of China's very long, remarkable history.
Right. And you focus there on the idea that we find our common humanity by studying the great philosophers and thinkers of every culture. In particular, you looked at Confucius and Buddha and Aristotle. I think I would differ with you on Aristotle and would have focused on Plato rather than Aristotle. That's a discussion for another time. But in any case, this idea of looking at the great cultures and the history, the best moments of the great cultures, is the exact opposite of so-called geopolitics, which is what guides the Western leaders today, deriving from ideologues like Alfred Mackinder and other ideologues of the British Empire. So, which their view is that the only way to advance is by putting down the other guy, the opposite of the interest of the other, and rather, and this, of course, leads to the sanctions policy. You didn't mention the sanctions when you talked about the theft of reserves, but even the sanctions policy, as I understand it, is based on the fact that people have to use the dollar in trade, and that therefore they think they have a right to impose these sanctions on countries. But in any case, China, of course, is not looking to suppress anybody else, and the massive sanctions against China and Russia and many other countries indicates a failure of thinking in terms of the great cultures and what can be done with a culture for the future. So how do we restore that looking to the great minds of antiquity in the West?
I think that there are two philosophical points that we really need to pay attention to that are quite fascinating, quite deep. One is the question of human nature, and the philosophers that I referred to, and I like Aristotle personally, but also I like the fact that Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius allow us to talk about the ABCs of philosophy. So it's getting back to the core ABCs. And what the ABCs, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius had in mind about human nature is that it is potentially good, meaning that with proper cultivation, proper education, proper mentoring, living in a decent community, people can learn to be harmonious. People can learn to be fair, trustworthy. People can learn reciprocity. So this is sometimes called virtue ethics, the idea that people can be decent, pretty good. Now, there's another philosophical strain which is deeply pessimistic. Augustine in Christian history is the exemplar of that. Man is fallen, and so man is a sinner, and there's no way out except perhaps by God's grace. But the sinfulness can't be washed away, and pessimists in history have believed that. And another pessimist like that had a huge influence is my second dimension, which is how people behave or how states interact. And Hobbes in a way is a follower of Augustine. Hobbes, of course, wrote in the 1600s, whereas Augustine was more than a millennium earlier than that. But Hobbes was the quintessential British philosopher who said people are rapacious, they are greedy, they are pushy, they are violent, and the best you can hope for is that someone controls them from killing each other. So he called for a very tight, centralized state for that purpose. But basically, the Hobbesian idea is that you can't do anything in a state of nature but defend yourself from being killed by someone else. And strangely enough, while British thinkers accepted that there would be a national government that would stop people from killing each other inside Britain, they took the view that internationally it is a Hobbesian war of all against all, that just countries fight with each other. And this is in the current thinking of international relations known as the realist school. And our leading realist thinker in the United States is John Mearsheimer at University of Chicago. He's a wonderful person and a tremendous gentleman and a great scholar. But he thinks that countries are, and especially great powers, are inevitably at each other's throats. And unfortunately, there's a lot of empirical evidence that this is often the case. But John Mearsheimer says the implication of this is that the world is tragic. His most famous book is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, because he says conflict is just about inevitable between major powers because nobody trusts each other. You can't trust each other. It's a war of all against all. It's eat or be eaten, kill or be killed. And so, yes, life's tragic. And I debate him. Again, we're friends and I admire him a lot. I want to be clear. But I say, John, we can't accept tragedy as our fate. We have to do better than that. And so I go back to the philosophers. And the philosophers taught, you can have harmony. That was Confucius's main message, which is it's possible actually to be decent. It's possible to observe what was famous for Confucius, and in similar terms for us in the Western culture as the golden rule. Do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. If you're a Hobbesian, you say, there goes Sachs moralizing, but that's not how the world is. I'm going to do what I can to the others because otherwise they're going to do something terrible to me and I'm going to get there first. And I say no.
Because that's human nature. That's what they are.
Because that's the deep human nature. That's inevitable.
Yeah, right.
But I don't believe it. It's certainly not the case that we're always at war against each other. We can be better than that. But by the way, China absolutely has a different history and a different mindset. And this is also a fascinating point. It's not just Confucius versus Hobbes. It's actually history. 2,000 years of statecraft. What have we learned? Well, in China, for most of the 2,000 years, there was a centralized state. This is very important. For most of the 2,000 years, there was the Han dynasty, or the Tang dynasty, or the Song dynasty, or the Yuan dynasty, or the Ming dynasty, or the Qing dynasty, or today the People's Republic of China. And for most of that 2,000 years, there was one country. And while there were rebellions and there were a lot of invasions from the north, mainly from the nomadic peoples in the dryland, grassland, steppe regions, there was one country, big population. Now in Europe, after 476 AD, when the Roman Empire fell in the West, There never again was one dominant power of Western Europe. So there was war nonstop. Think of Britain and France, for example. How many years were they at war during the past 1,000 years? An incredible amount across the channel. Now compare that with China and Japan. How many years were China and Japan at war between, well, you could take it back before 1000 AD, but say from 1000 AD to 1890? The answer is 2 years. I think it's 1274 and 1281, if I remember correctly. And there was actually one incursion a third year. Now, two of those were when the Mongols ruled China, and they tried to invade Japan and failed on 2 occasions. Once was when a shogun, a military commander of Japan, ridiculously tried to invade China and was terribly defeated in the Korean Peninsula. But my point is not that. My point is they didn't fight for 1,000 years. Barely a skirmish. By the way, when Japan industrialized and was the first industrializing nation, Japan followed the realist approach, sadly. Japan said, okay, now we're part of the imperial club. Now we're going to go invade China. And the Chinese diplomat said, what are you doing? We're Asians. And Japan said, no, 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 now we're part of the Western club. This was back in the 1890s. So Japan really behaved badly by becoming an imperialist power for some period, but China never did in that way. And if we understand the different philosophical roots, this is crucial. If we understand the different experience of Europe and China, we can come to appreciate that our mindset in the West that, well, it's war all the time, so China's an enemy, so we better go at it, is nothing the way that China thinks. And when I said to John Mearsheimer, again, I want to stress, a friend and and a brilliant scholar, when I said all this warmongering against China is going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy of war, he said, yes. I said, John, self-fulfilling, we don't need to have that war. He said, yes, but that's how it is. And I said, no, we don't need to have it that way. We can do better than that. So that's the debate.
Helga issued what she calls the 10 principles for an architecture of security and development for the world as a whole. And most of them are sort of self-evident. You need education, you need cultural training, you need health, so forth. But the 10th principle is exactly what you just brought up, that the nature of man is good. And this is the one that's most difficult for people to accept or understand. But it's the fundamental one. It's really the issue, as I think you correctly just located. This is what distinguishes the idea of being committed to global development rather than global war. And of course, as you said, also the Confucian concept of harmony and the concentration on education is really the center of the Chinese development of their own country over the last 40 years. And what's now being taken out to the rest of the world through the Belt and Road. And as you know, we just had the Belt and Road third Belt and Road Forum in Beijing with 150 countries represented, which certainly demonstrates that they've failed miserably in the isolation of China in the world, and that the idea that they could get countries to decouple from China has just forced most countries to say, you're crazy. This is where development is, rather than war and sanctions. And in fact, the headline of our EIR this week is going to be on the fact that Xi Jinping offered a $100 billion new investments through the Belt and Road. At the same time, that Mr. Biden was offering a $100 billion investment in wars, naming specifically Russia, meaning Ukraine, Israel, the genocide being carried out against the Palestinians, and China. They included Taiwan as one of the places where this $100 billion. So it's pretty clear that they're talking about a global war. And the only question is, how can this madness be stopped and reversed?
Well, it is so unacceptable American foreign policy. And what I hope people are coming to understand is that the arrogance and the militarization of the United States that has been demonstrated time and again now over the past 30 years is not bringing security to the U.S. It has busted the budget. We've spent trillions of dollars on these horrible wars that have accomplished nothing except violence and destruction and rising debt. And they're not making America safer at all. There are more and more wars that are a reflection of this arrogance, because the arrogance has meant that American policymakers have thought, we can do what we want and we don't have to talk with anybody about it. We don't need diplomacy. We just need our military. And the military can't solve political problems. And we're finding out again and again that the military approach doesn't work to solve the deeper problems of humanity, and can't settle political issues. For that, you need politics. You need diplomacy. And I mean politics in the positive sense of getting together to work out arrangements for people to live peacefully together. So I think the failures of American foreign policy are on full display. Also, the ignorance of it, because I would cite our National Security Advisor's statement, Jake Sullivan, about a week before the violence blew up in Israel and Gaza with the Hamas attack and now the bombing of Gaza. Jake Sullivan said, the Middle East is the quietest that it's been in 2 decades. And it shows they don't know anything except what their own imagination is, and they don't understand what's happening around the world. What's happening around the world is that people want a different approach. They want development. They want social justice. They want the chance for decent lives. They don't want the militarized approach. Mike, we're going to have to go. Great to speak with you, and I have a call starting right now. We are in need of this dialogue for 2 basic reasons that I'd like to elaborate just briefly. One is we are in a new world in these years, and we're trying to navigate a new world. By that I mean the world that we have thought we knew in some places, a rather naive idea, was a Western-led world. And that was an idea that predominated from roughly 1820 to, I would say, the middle of the 20th century. But the notion of Western-led world continued at least until the end of the 20th century. That world is finished, but we don't know it yet. And it's that ignorance of the end of the Western-led world which is at the heart of the very, very serious tensions between the United States and China, for example, because the Western-led world has finished, the United States doesn't know it, and this means that we have a very deep misunderstanding about the nature of our current global reality. The second reason why we are here is that all together we are wrecking the world, the natural environment. So this is a feature of common humanity for a common global commons, which is the title of our meeting. I'd like to say just a few words about how we got here to give you my perspective. For most of the known history of the last 2 millennia, there was no question that Asia was the center of the world economy because it was well over half of the world population. The nature of life pretty much across the world did not vary so widely. So what we would call per capita incomes were similar. People were small farmers in villages, and this was true whether it was in Western Europe, whether it was Native Americans, whether it was in Chinese villages, whether it was in African villages. The population of the world was, from 1 AD onward, enormous in the Indian subcontinent and in China. And this meant that Asia was the center of gravity, if you would make that calculation of the world economy as well as of the world demography. More than that, China was the dynamic country of the world technology and many civilizational inventions, especially during the Song dynasty from 960 till 1279, till the Mongol conquest. The Song dynasty was a remarkable period of technological fecundity, of economic gain, of multiple fundamental inventions, from the use of the compass for navigation, paper currency, public administration, ocean navigation, movable type printing, and countless other inventions that changed the world fundamentally. So not only was China populous, but China was really dominant. And throughout much of Asia, and especially East Asia, it was China that set the civilizational patterns for what is today's countries of Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea. And this civilization, which was a Neo-Confucian civilization, was a remarkable achievement. At this time, we had the high medieval period in Western Europe, and some breakthroughs were starting, a lot of wars, by the way, and but Europe would have looked to any observer at the time as a taker of technology, a receiver of technology, not as a maker or giver of technology. And the technology came from the East in many directions, from the Arab world, from the Indian subcontinent, from China. There are some notable dates. The worst economic policy mistake in human history was made by China in 1434, when the Ming Dynasty decided to end ocean navigation and to scrap the fleet of Admiral Zheng He. Because China would have discovered the New World, it would have discovered the Americas, it would have created a world economy, but China was concerned, the court was concerned about the incursions from the north, not from the gains of ocean navigation, and the great fleet of Admiral Zheng was ended, and those were the end of the ocean navigations. The oceans were given over to the Europeans, actually. This was really one of the most decisive own goals of human history, I have to say. Now, the next date that's important is 1492, because as China vacated the oceans, Portugal and Spain filled the oceans using Chinese technology, by the way, the ocean navigation and the gunpowder, which all had come from China, to begin an age of navigation. Still, without the fortuitous fact that heading west from Europe landed a continent that was not known to the Europeans, history would not have changed all that fundamentally. But the Americas became a resource base for Europe's development for the next 4 centuries, which fundamentally changed the world. And Adam Smith, writing in 1776, said that the 2 most significant events in the history of mankind were the discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1492 and the discovery of the path around the Cape of Good Hope by Vasco da Gama in 1498. So that was a turning point. Still, Asia was dominant, but this little peninsula on the far west of Eurasia began to explore and ironically conquered the Americas, and that was by virtue of pathogens rather than any dominance, because the Europeans brought smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, and many other diseases, and wiped out the Native American populations by around 95%, and were able to conquer, therefore, 2 continents of massive resource base. So history began to change. The next date that I would suggest is fundamental is 1776. That's a very interesting year. 4 things happened that year. You know some of them. The most important was James Watt patented the steam engine in that year. A second decisive event was that Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. The third decisive event was that Gibbon published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then there was something, a Declaration of Independence of some country also. All happened in that year. But the invention of the steam engine was a turning point as significant as 1434 and 1492, because though the steam engine had been invented by China, it had not been utilized by any scale in China. China had invented the steam engine about 700 years earlier. Watt improved the steam engine with a condenser, and Britain became the first industrial country. And this was very significant because in 1839, my next date, Britain invaded China in the First Opium War. The war fought to make the world safe for opium addiction. Really a sordid act, but just an illustration of what had changed fundamentally in power. From China's dominance, now China was in defeat by the British, by a British expeditionary force from not quite halfway around the world, but was able to defeat the Chinese Ming or Qing, Qing Empire. Of course, I won't go into long history, but the defeats in the 2 Opium Wars was followed by the Taiping Rebellion and by probably the worst civil war perhaps in human history in terms of the human toll in the Taiping Rebellion. And China went from being an absolute great power to being a subjected country, and one that faced extreme poverty and hardship later in invasion by many imperial powers along the coast, and then the invasion by Japan starting in 1894, 95, and then in the 20th century. For me, the next turning point is 1947 and 1949, the independence of India and the independence of China. I think there's one key point in history, which is a colonized or imperialized country cannot achieve economic development or success because it is not in the interest of the imperial power to have success in its colonies. The interest of an imperial power is extraction. And so until independence came after this terrible 100 years, China and India were left behind, far behind economic development. So the next turning point in history was the middle of the 20th century when Asia began to recover. And if you look statistically, Asia had been around 60% of world output for 1800 years, roughly, from as much as one can measure this, from 1 AD to roughly 1800 AD. And then by 1950, it had declined to 15%, or perhaps 20% of world output, though the population was still 60%. So the per capita income had collapsed. What we are experiencing now is the recovery of normality, not something outside of human experience, but actually the recovery of normality, because what was abnormal was that a small part of the world, the North Atlantic region, would so dominate the whole world. And that was by virtue of the technological advances, starting with steam engine, and then the militarization of those technologies, which led to a century of imperial domination by Western countries. This would have lasted longer, but the West fought two disastrous, bloody civil wars, World War I and World War II, and by the end of that period, it was, of course, morally, politically, economically, financially, militarily incapable of empire. And with some lagging battles, the countries found their way to independence. So Asia began to recover dramatically fast. And by around 2010, China was larger than the US economy in absolute size, measured in purchasing power terms, but not surprising because China is more than 4 times the US population, or was then. Now it's about 4 times the US population. And so naturally it would become a bigger country. 2 implications, and I'll stop here. One is that now that the whole world is industrializing, and we're going to have development everywhere. India was behind China by about 15 or 20 years, but now India is growing faster than China, is likely to continue to do so. Africa is going to grow faster than both India and China in the next 40 years because it's going to be catching up from farther back. And by the way, Africa right now has the same size population as China and India. All are 1.4 billion. But Africa will be the biggest by mid-century, by far. So if there's an African Union, the African Union will be the most populous part of the world by 2050, by far. And it will be a dynamic part of the world economy also. So we're going to have lots of mindset changes in the years ahead. But there are 2 significant conclusions from this. One is mainly the United States has been shocked at China's rise. And I have to say to my Chinese friends, you didn't ask permission, you know? The US is supposed to be in charge. And now, without US permission, you became so big and powerful, and that is a bit unforgivable in the American mentality. The Americans cannot figure it out because they know no history at all, I'm sorry to say. We're doing our best as teachers, but we're not doing very well. So the idea that what's happened in China is a return to normal is ununderstandable. And this is why there's so much tension right now. So it's very serious. And the tension came when China declared in the Made in China 2025 program, we will become key leaders of leading technologies. That was the biggest affront to the Americans. I say bravo, go for it. This is good for the world. Technological advance anywhere lifts everyone, by the way, as long as it's not militarized and leads to destruction, but as long as it's used for human well-being. And by the way, Chinese technologies are already core to saving the world, whether it's medicines like artemisinin or whether it's the lowest cost solar production, solar modules. This is Chinese technology and we need it. It's going to be critical for world well-being. But one thing is the tension coming with China's recovery. We need dialogue on this to understand it. So that's one part. Second is that as the whole world economy has grown roughly 100 times since James Watt's steam engine, I would say realistically maybe 250 times since James Watt's steam engine, we're wrecking the natural environment. We really are. It's extremely serious. It's very late in the day. And so we need a common understanding of how we're going to get our own now globally shared technologies under control. So that is why I'm so happy to be here. I do think we're going to figure this out. But the strangest part of globalization is how little global dialogue there is. It's the paradox. It's so easy to have connection. You can get on a Zoom with anybody, but it's a big event if an American official talks to a Chinese official. It should be happening dozens of times a day, not top news. And I keep offering to President Biden, I'll give you a Zoom link. You can call President Putin and make peace. Or a phone number. I'll lend you my cell phone. Make a call. But here we are completely interconnected, but we don't talk with each other. And the specialty of the church is talking with each other. So here we are. Thank you very much. I want to talk about the big picture, which Ned always bids us to do, and that means the world. And why I believe that we're at a time of a fundamental change of politics. And by politics, I mean all dimensions of collective action. In economics, of course, politics is essentially about meeting public goods. Public goods change over time because of changes in the human condition, in technology, in scale, in the nature of the challenges. Today's challenges are global and regional, and by regional I mean international at a scale typically of a continent. We grew up in the era of the nation state. The nation is no longer a good definition of where the main public goods lie for most purposes, and so we're moving, I think, away from a nation state system to a more complex system of governance. But it's not easy because every institution, such as the UN at the global level or the EU at the regional level or ASEAN, is basically still driven by the nation state. That's where the power, the taxation, and the armies are. And so the nation states won't give up their prerogatives easily, though they are the wrong level of aggregation to solve the problems that we have. So a great deal of our global problems are that we're trying to solve global and regional problems or local problems with nation states. That is a legacy of the Western European system. It's anachronistic. We're not over it yet, but things are changing very quickly. So what are some key characteristics of the current era? First, the most important fundamental characteristic is an economic convergence between the North Atlantic region, which led the world economy for the last 250 years, and the rest of the world. Not all of the rest of the world, to be sure, but even the lagging parts of the world most notably Africa, I believe will have a very rapid catching up in the next decades. So I think convergence is the dominant feature of the world economic scene. This is creating multipolar geopolitics. They'll be nice when you go to Washington, just whisper that, don't say it loudly. Washington still believes that it's a unipolar world. It is delusional, it's creating wars and conflict, but we are in a multipolar world, whether Washington likes it or not. Of course, we're in an era of hyper-rapid technological change, the fastest in history, because we now have machines that make the change for us as well, and we have an acceleration of technological change. All technological pessimism, I think, is a mistake. We have no shortage of technological breakthroughs. Of course, how we use the technologies is quite another matter. Is it AI for drones, or is it AI to solve problems? And we're not quite clear on that. We have, of course, profound environmental crises that are deep, real, intensifying, and at an urgent stage. We're already in the acute phase of human-induced climate change, destruction of biodiversity, massive pollution, which claims many millions of lives per year, and already in the acute phase. These are all public human-induced climate change, destruction of biodiversity, massive pollution, which we hear wisdom someplace. Thank you. These all require public goods of a new kind at a global, regional, biome, ecosystem scale. And of course, we're grappling with creating that, and we're not succeeding now 51 years after the first conference on environment and economy in Stockholm. We have rapid demographic change, not all bad. The world population is going to stabilize and start to decline in the 21st century. That's a good thing. We're completing the demographic transition, an aging economy, an urban world economy, a significant rise of Africa's share in the world economy to perhaps 1/4 or even 1/3 of the world population by later in this century. And we now, as I'm emphasizing, have public goods at regional, by that I mean transnational and global scale, to an extent that is unprecedented. And that requires a different kind of governance. So we have outgrown the nation state. We need political subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the concept that we don't have competing polities at different levels. We have a kind of a circle of politics where global problems get solved globally, regional problems get addressed regionally, national problems get addressed nationally, local problems get addressed locally, with the basic dictum, go as local as possible, consistent with the problem. And I think that this is the right idea about public goods. US hegemony is a chimera, very dangerous right now because everybody knows it except the United States. And so the US is actually provoking a lot of war and tension and conflict right now as it struggles to come to grips with its limited power. And fourth, we're going to need an ethical basis for the global and regional public goods, because all of economic life depends on an ethical formation, shared precepts, implicit or explicit, and this now has to happen at a global level, and I'll give a few thoughts to that very quickly. I wrote a bit about this in a book in 2020 called The Ages of Globalization, and my main theme was that to understand global scale change, we need to understand the interplay of physical geography, technological change, and institutional change. And all three are paramount in our own age. And of course, as a materialist as I am, I believe that human history has essentially been paced by technological breakthroughs and essentially in energy, food, transport, and data. Data defined broadly to include computation, transmission, storage of information. And the major eras of human change are eras of breakthrough. Fire was the first era that enabled us to have larger brains, so the encephalization came with the harnessing of fire, the harnessing of agriculture, the domestication of the horse, the discovery of how to mobilize wind and water power already 2.5 to 3 millennia ago. Of course, the breakthrough with fossil fuel, with the steam engine in the 18th century, with the electric dynamo in the 19th century, nuclear age, and so forth. So all of this is to say we are very much paced by large technological changes. The dominant technological changes of our day came out of the wonderful imagination of Alan Turing and John von Neumann and the architects of the digital world with the transistors and integrated circuits. And this is a deep transformation that is propelling us today. So in good classical Enlightenment form, I approach this as a stadial theory of change, meaning you make stages. I designate 7 stages. I won't go through them in this brief period, but each is paced by major technological change, which gives rise to political change. It creates city-states, or nations, or empires, or transoceanic empires. And we are in another phase of fundamental political change. So just a word about the geography of long-term development. An unbelievable amount of economic development takes place between these narrow latitudes because they are favored with the lucky fortune of a band of east-west geography of temperate and semi-arid zone steppelands and temperate agriculture, which encompassed typically 70 or 80% of the world population, and almost all of the technological changes in history, and the major empires line up incredibly along this line throughout history. So in most of human history, Asia was, from as far back as we know it, the most populated part of the world, 65 to 70% of world population. China and India have been giants in population for 2 millennia at least. And for most of that time, per capita income didn't vary so much as we know, and I'm using Angus Madison's famous estimates here. It meant that the shares of output more or less tracked the shares of population, with the modest variation for different periods, like the Song Dynasty being a particularly prosperous period in China, for example. But aside from the ups and downs, Asia was the center of gravity of the world system. Then, of course, this began to change very gradually after the beginning of the 16th century, in the so-called Age of Discovery or Age of Conquest, and it really took off after the end of the 18th century because of the steam engine, fundamentally, the era of industrialization. And since that came to England first, England used that to conquer much of the world. Just to say, as everybody knows, it is the great accident of history that Europe became the first to industrialize and to conquer Asia, because it was absolutely far more likely, I'd say something like 10 to 1 in favor of China in the 15th century, that it would go the other way. China was very close to discovering the sea routes to Europe and even possibly to the Americas across the northern Pacific. But in 1434, the single worst economic policy mistake in human history was made when the mandarins at the Ming court scrapped the Chinese fleet and just ended what was the mega age of discovery and oceanic transport of the giant fleets of Admiral Zheng He. Absolutely no deep reason for it. It was a catastrophic mistake. The next time the sea routes were opened between Europe and Asia was Europeans going to conquer Asia, not Asians going to explore and trade with Europe. So Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And my favorite lines from The Wealth of Nations, which is a remarkably wonderful and humane book, as well as a brilliant treatise. But my favorite part is this. Adam Smith says, the discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope, that's 1498 and 1492, are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Big statement, not bad. Connecting the whole world by these two oceanic voyages. Their consequences have already been very great, but in the short period of between 2 and 3 centuries, because Smith is writing in 1776, which has elapsed since these discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. And then what's wonderful about Smith in the Scottish Enlightenment is he points out that while this was generally a beneficial fact to unite the world, it was disastrous for the native inhabitants of the East and West Indies, he says, because he says that they were relatively weak at the time. He didn't understand that they also brought pathogens of the old world to the Americas that wiped out the population. So Smith could not have understood that, but he did understand conquest. And he said something incredibly humane at the end, which I think marks him as one of the great thinkers of modern times. He said, hereafter, perhaps the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. But nothing seems more likely to establish this equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all sorts of improvements, which an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries naturally, or rather necessarily, carries along with it. So what Smith is saying is, in the future, there's going to come an equality because trade is going to carry knowledge, technological improvement, and an equality of force. Basically, we are 250 years after Smith's writing, and that prediction has come true now. So Smith was in the middle of a 500-year period. 500 years ago, Asia in the lead and the center of gravity and in the technological lead. Europe becomes the agent of change. The steam engine, a reflection of that, not something that came out of the blue, but came out of Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and empire. But it came out of a Glasgow workshop, the condenser on James Watt's steam engine. And there came a new European and North Atlantic-led world. But as Adam Smith said, eventually trade will rebalance, and that's the convergence that we're seeing now. So Watt's steam engine, historians are right to say that what was so fundamental about the steam engine is that it broke the organic barrier of the traditional economy, because basically almost all energy of the primary energy of the pre-James Watt economy was organic. What you could feed to human beings for their labor and what you could feed to the animals for animal traction, plus a little bit of wind and a little bit of water. But basically an organic economy, and we moved to a fossil fuel economy, and that let loose the ability to do work of an unimaginable scale. So everything changed with the fossil fuel breakthrough in the last 2.5 centuries. And of course, Europe got there first, and Britain got there first of the first. And in the geopolitics, we ended up with the British world. This is a map of a wonderful book, The Countries Never Invaded by Britain. Those are the ones in white. Britain went out and just beat the shit out of everybody. And really nasty, by the way. Nasty. In 1839, showed up in China and saying, you have to import our opium. No, we don't want your opium. You don't want our opium? We'll beat the hell out of you. That was the first Opium War. It was followed by the Second Opium War. no scruples at all. Sorry to say. So that's power. That's the power of one-sided industrialization, and it conquered much of the world. Long story, and I won't go into it, but the baton was passed to the younger Anglo-American kid brother in 1945, the great Anglo-Saxon handoff, and the US became the next empire. And the idea was that we would dot the world with 800 military bases around the world, and Henry Luce made the sweetest love song to American leaders, telling them this is the American century. That is always captivating. It was captivating to Chinggis Khan, it was captivating to Lord Palmerston, and it has been captivating to American leaders since then also, to believe this is your century in the world. It's over, but we still have 800 military bases around the world. I believe the Ukraine war is likely to be America's Teutoburg Forest defeat. Teutoburg Forest was the loss by Augustus Octavian in AD 9, when the Roman Empire tried to cross the Rhine to the east to take over Germania and was defeated. It didn't end the Roman Empire. It just told them, this is a limit, and you're not going beyond that limit. And the United States is going to learn a limit that NATO doesn't just expand at US will. There are limits to that, and that's the painful process that we're in right now. But it's a secret. Don't tell anyone outside. You're likely to be canceled if you do. So the world changed fundamentally after the Second World War. The United States aspired to be the world leader, but something else happened to bring Adam Smith's forecast to reality, and that was the end of the imperial age. If there is one dimension of imperialism that I think needs to be understood, it is that imperial powers do not educate the natives. And if there's one dimension of economic development that needs to be understood, it is that education is the absolute central feature of development. Because without education, nothing else can happen. And so the European imperial powers left the world illiterate, left their colonies basically illiterate. At the end of the colonial rule, the first thing that happened was mass education. We're still not there yet. But this is the most fundamental breakthrough that happened after World War II, the end of the colonial imperial era. And the United States does its empire in a different way through regime change operations, so it's not exactly the same as the occupation imperialism. But what countries got with their sovereignty was the ability to educate their people. And this has led to economic convergence. Just to show you the gaps, the peak of North Atlantic power was 1950 compared to the rest of the world. 56% of the literate world in 1950, roughly by my calculation, was in the North Atlantic region, meaning Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. Now it's 13% of the literate world. 60% of world output was in the North Atlantic region. Now it's 33% at purchasing power prices. 53% of all urban residents were in the North Atlantic world in 1950. Now it's 14%. The world's converged. Urban, literate, technologies have spread. Adam Smith was right that trade was actually the fundamental carrier of this. It was when China opened up that the acceleration of technological change came so fast to China. It was Japan that invented this process of rapid infusion of technology in the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and then again after World War II in its rebuilding. So we now see that Asia and the North Atlantic regions have crossed paths, again using Madison's data updated by IMF data. The North Atlantic was the dominant power until this gap started to close in 1950. And by around 2010, Asia is now larger than the North Atlantic region. This is the real change of the world. We know that the BRICS even before the recent expansion to 6 more countries, were already larger than the G7. That's a transformed world. And China, of course, overtook the US in GDP measured at purchasing power parity around 2014. But China is still much poorer per capita, maybe a third, but with more than 4 times the population. So this is the reason that China is a larger economy. So I want to argue very briefly that we're in a new age which I call the age of sustainable development. We're there in part because the scale of economic activity and a population 10 times the size of when Thomas Robert Malthus wrote The Principles of Population in 1798, which was then about 900 million people, and today 8 billion people, now has put so much pressure on the physical environment that we are in urgent need of global public response to climate, biodiversity destruction, loss of ecosystem functions, and so forth. And the world adopted goals addressed to this. It's fitfully trying to achieve them. Today at the UN, this very day is the midpoint review of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're way off track, nice objectives not being achieved, mainly because the United States and other rich countries don't care at all about it. And so the world governance is not organized to achieve these goals at this point. But these goals are the real global goals and needs. So we have a very perilous moment because we have arrived at multipolarity. And as Adam Smith talked about, that balance of awe and equality of force to create justice, that's a delicate, difficult transformation. And just to say, there are several different theories of what's going on right now. Robert Kagan, whom you may know as our chief neocon ideologue and the husband of our acting Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, believes that American hegemony must rule and will continue to rule. Otherwise, the jungle will grow back, as he says. Wow. Henry Kissinger says that we need a balance of power theory. Balance of power is okay, except it becomes imbalanced, and it's extremely difficult to manage. And when Bismarck was thrown out by Kaiser Wilhelm II, it was the end of Europe's balance of power, and World War I came in response when Bismarck's genius at balancing was lost. John Mearsheimer says we are inevitably in tragedy. That's just the nature of great power politics. Mearsheimer is extremely intelligent, predictive, an extremely nice person, but tragic to read because he says that conflict is inevitable. I don't buy it. Now, another theory that I read 50 years ago of a wonderful professor of mine also, Charles Kindleberger, said we need a hegemon. So if it's not the US or Britain, it's got to be someone else like China. I don't buy that either, but this is a brilliant book. Boy, it led to a lot of late night discussions over the next 50 years. Graham Allison says, as with Sparta and Athens, we're prone for war, not inevitable, but the war trigger is very high because of the rise of China. And my little contribution is, could we get our heads together and address global public goods and avoid global public bad? So I argue that we need a rational approach, not a tragic approach, and that it is not beyond us to reach the cooperative corner of the prisoner's dilemma. In other words, we can understand the game, we can understand the risks of defection, but we can understand the benefits of cooperation. And so we should be able to reach that cooperative outcome. So I would argue that we need a new geopolitics and a new ethics of sustainable development. I often refer to President Kennedy's inaugural address when he said, the world is very different now. For man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. So what hangs in the balance is something extraordinary. We could achieve SDG 1, end poverty, or we could blow up the world. And what is absolutely incredible is how this is in the hands of a very few people. That's what's incredible. And by the way, my takeaway from Oppenheimer was what a bunch of geniuses that invented the bomb and what a bunch of dolts who use it or decide about using it. This is our paradox. It took the greatest geniuses of the age to understand nuclear fission and how this could be created, and then it fell into the hands of the everyday person who might not have the imagination to keep us away from global disaster. That's technology, by the way. Technology is often created by geniuses and used by all of us. That is the real issue that Plato was wondering about already in the Republic 2,350 years ago. How do you make the rulers know what to do? He said you have to raise them from birth for that purpose. So there are crucial public goods at regional and global scale. This is something new. Regional scale, like the European Union or ASEAN or African Union, this is something new, how important this scale is. And global scale is almost unprecedented in human history. We had global trade, we had interconnectedness, but global public goods, not so much. Now we are with the center of global public goods, but institutions in the hands of nation states. Why? Weird. So I believe we need new kinds of global governance and ethics, and I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good place to start. We're in the 75th anniversary this year. And I believe that we can even find a common wisdom, which I call the ABCs of ancient wisdom, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. They all, by the way, were virtue ethicists. They basically said, cultivate your soul as decent people. It said it in somewhat different ways, but they said it's virtue that gives us the capacity to reach the cooperative solution, whether it's civic virtue, friendship virtue, or the other virtues of sociality. And Aristotle said it's possible because we are zoon politikon, we are political animals. We can be sociable. And so I think finding this commonality of East and West is crucial now because there actually is a strong commonality of the underlying cultures. This was already pointed out in the observations of the axial age, that these philosophies arose roughly the same time and with roughly the same philosophical underpinnings. And I'll just end with President Kennedy's remarks 60 years ago. We're at the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's remarkable initiative to make peace at the height of the Cold War and to negotiate the partial nuclear test ban treaty, which was ratified just these days 60 years ago. Kennedy may well have been killed for it because rogue elements of the US government hated him for his peace initiatives, and I believe that this is probably what did him in. But he made wonderful observations about peace, and I'll just end with his most beautiful words. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much.